March 6, 1944. High above the German capital, a young Luftwaffe pilot banked his Messerschmitt toward the sun and saw something that could not be real. Below him stretched the bombers. Hundreds of American B-17S and B-24S grinding east through the cold air toward Berlin. That part he expected. The bombers had been coming for months, but around them, weaving and circling like sheepdogs, were single-engine fighters. Sleek. Fast. Wearing white American stars. That was impossible. Berlin sat more than 500 miles from England. No single-engine fighter could fly that far, fight a battle, and fly home again. For 2 years, that simple fact had been the Luftwaffe's shield. The bombers might reach the heart of Germany, but their little escorts always had to turn back at the border. And the moment they turned back, the German fighters pounced. Not today. Today the escorts had come all the way. They were over Berlin itself. The pilot did not know the name of the aircraft turning toward him. Soon every man in the Luftwaffe would know it. The North American P-51 Mustang. And the head of the entire German Air Force, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, would later sum up that moment in one bitter sentence. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin," he said, "I knew the jig was up." This is the story of how a fighter that almost never got built became the machine that broke the German Air Force. It is the story of an American airframe, a British engine, and a few hundred gallons of fuel that changed the entire war in the sky. To understand why the Mustang mattered so much, you have to understand the disaster that came before it. In the summer of 1943, the American air war was built on a single proud idea. The self-defending bomber, the B-17 Flying Fortress, bristled with machine guns. American planners believed that if you packed enough bombers into a tight box, their combined fire could beat off any attacker. They would not need fighters to hold their hand. They could fly deep into Germany alone. It was a beautiful theory. It was also wrong, and men died proving it. On the 17th of August, 1943, the 8th Air Force struck the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the aircraft works at Regensburg. Ball bearings were tiny, but they were everywhere. They spun inside every German engine, every tank, every gun. Cripple the bearings, the planners said, and you cripple the whole war machine. The bombers went in deep. The fighters could not follow, and once the escorts peeled away, the German pilots fell on the formations and stayed on them for hours. If you're an enthusiast of military technology and World War II, please consider subscribing to us. It would greatly help our channel. Thank you. 60 bombers did not come home that day. 600 men. 2 months later, the Americans tried again. The 14th of October, 1944. They went back to Schweinfurt. The day earned a name the crews would never forget. Black Thursday. Of 291 bombers, 77 were lost or written off. More than 100 others came home torn and bleeding. In a single afternoon, the 8th Air Force lost more airmen than the entire Royal Air Force had lost in the whole Battle of Britain. The math was brutal and simple. A crew needed 25 missions to finish a tour. At these loss rates, the average man would never make it. The American High Command had no choice. Deep daylight raids into Germany were halted. The bombers stayed home or stayed close to the coast and waited. The self-defending bomber was dead. Something had to escort these men all the way to the target and all the way back. Nothing in the inventory could do it. Nothing, that is, except an aircraft that almost everyone had already overlooked. The Mustang's story did not even begin as an American one. It began with the British. In 1940, with German tanks rolling across France, Britain was desperate for fighters. A British purchasing team came to North American Aviation in California and asked them to build P-40 Warhawks under license. North American made a bold counteroffer. "Give us a few months," they said, "and we will design you something far better." They were as good as their word. The prototype flew in October 1940. It was clean, fast, and beautiful, with a smooth new kind of wing that slipped through the air with very little drag. The British took it, called it the Mustang, and liked it. But there was a problem, and it lived under the engine cowling. The early Mustang used an American Allison engine. Down low, near the Yasai ground, it was wonderful. It was quick and strong and nimble, but the Allison had only a simple single-stage supercharger. As the aircraft climbed, the air grew thin and the engine began to gasp. Above about 15,000 feet, the speed and the climb simply fell away. That was a fatal flaw for a fighter. The great air battles of this war were fought high up, where the bombers flew at 25 and 30,000 feet. Up there, the lovely Mustang ran out of breath, so the British used it for low-level work. Reconnaissance, ground attack. A fine aircraft doing a small job. Its real gift, hidden inside that smooth airframe, sat completely wasted. It took one test pilot on one flight to see it. In the spring of 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronnie Harker climbed into a Mustang at a British airfield. He was a Rolls-Royce man through and through, and Rolls-Royce built the most famous engine of the war, the Merlin. Harker flew the Mustang and fell half in love with the airframe. He could feel how slick it was, how little it fought the air, but he could also feel the Allison choking up high. And Harker had a thought that would echo through history. What if you put a proper Merlin in this thing? Not the old Merlin, but the new one, with a two-stage supercharger. The same engine that made the Spitfire so deadly at altitude. He wrote up his idea. At first, almost nobody wanted it. Merlin engines were precious. Every one of them was already promised to Spitfires and Lancasters and Mosquitoes. But Harker pushed, and in the end, the British took 5 Mustang airframes and fitted them with the new Merlin to see what would happen. What happened was a miracle of engineering. The transformation was almost unbelievable. With the old engine, the Mustang topped out around 390 miles an hour and only down low. With the Merlin, it could reach nearly 440 miles an hour, and it could do it at 25 and 30,000 feet in the thin air where it used to falter. The aircraft that gasped at altitude could now fight and win in the very place the war was decided. The Americans took the idea and ran with it. They had the Merlin built under license in the United States by Packard so they could make it in huge numbers. They married it to the airframe. They added a 4th blade to the propeller. The new fighter was called the P-51B, and later, with a bubble canopy and 6 heavy machine guns, the P-51D. A government committee in 1944 called it the most aerodynamically perfect pursuit plane in existence. But raw speed was only half the answer. The Mustang had one more trick, and it was the trick that changed everything. The smooth wing that made the Mustang so fast also made it sip fuel instead of gulping it. It could carry a large internal load, and under each wing it could hang a pair of drop tanks. Cheap external tanks, full of fuel that the pilot used up first and then simply let fall away when the fighting started. Add it all together and you had something nobody had ever managed before. A high-altitude fighter that could match the best the Germans had and still fly hundreds of miles into Germany and back. With drop tanks, its combat reach stretched out past 700 and even 800 miles. It could go to Berlin, fight a battle over the city, and come home for tea. The bomber crews had a tender name for their escorts. They called them the Little Friends. Now, at last, the Little Friends could stay for the whole trip. There was one more piece, a change not in metal but in mind. In January 1944, a new commander took over the 8th Air Force, General Jimmy Doolittle. He walked into the fighter operations room and reportedly saw a sign on the wall that read, The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. Doolittle ordered it taken down. He had a new sign put up. The first duty of the fighters now was to destroy German fighters. It sounds like a small thing. It was enormous. Until then, escorts had been chained to the bombers, forced to fly slow and close, forever on the defensive. Doolittle cut them loose. Now the Mustangs could range ahead, hunt the German fighters before they ever reached the bombers, and chase them all the way down to their own runways. This was the deadly logic of 1944. The Americans did not just want to protect the bombers. They wanted to use the bombers as bait, send them over a target the Germans had to defend, like Berlin, and the Luftwaffe would be forced to come up and fight. And when they came up, the Mustangs would be waiting. If you're an enthusiast of military technology and World War II, please consider subscribing to us. It would greatly help our channel. Thank you. In late February 1944 came the test. The Americans called it Big Week. For 6 days, wave after wave of bombers struck the German aircraft industry, and this time the Mustangs and the other escorts came with them in strength. The Germans rose to defend their factories, exactly as the plan demanded, and they were ground down in the air. Then came March. On the 4th, single-engine American fighters reached Berlin for the very first time. 2 days later, on the 6th, they came back in force, with over 800 bombers and more than 900 escorts. It was the largest air battle of the entire war in Europe, and it was savage. The Germans fought with everything they had. A gap opened in the fighter cover, and for a few terrible minutes the bombers were exposed. 69 American bombers were lost that day. Black Thursday had cost 77. The Americans paid a heavy price over Berlin. But here was the difference. This time, the Americans could afford it and the Germans could not. When an American bomber and crew were lost, the factories back home were already building their replacements faster than they could be shot down. When a German fighter pilot was lost, he was gone, and so was every hour of training that had gone into him. The Mustangs were not just shooting down aircraft, they were killing the Luftwaffe's irreplaceable veterans, faster than Germany could ever make new ones. By the spring of 1944, German pilots noticed something that chilled them. Their old pattern no longer worked. The escorts did not turn back at the border anymore. They stayed. They followed German fighters as they tried to form up. They chased them when they broke away. They threatened them even over their own airfields. The sanctuary was gone. There was no safe sky left. Behind the machine were the men who flew it, and their stories are the heart of this. Consider Major George Preddy. A slight young man from Greensboro, North Carolina, he did not look like a killer. Before the war, he had tried again and again to become a Navy pilot and been turned away. He started his combat career in the Pacific in a clumsy old P-40, where he was once badly hurt in a mid-air collision during training and spent months recovering. Then he found the Mustang, and the Mustang found him. Preddy named his fighters Cripes A-Mighty, after a phrase he liked to use over a game of dice. On the 6th of August 1944, he flew one of the great missions of the war. He shot down 6 German fighters in a single flight. He came home pale and sick, climbing down from his cockpit barely able to stand, having flown the whole brutal day fighting off a hangover. Of that mission, he said simply, "I just kept shooting and they just kept falling." Preddy could have gone home for good. He had flown his tour and then extension after extension. He kept choosing to come back. By the end of 1944, he was the top-scoring Mustang ace of the entire war with nearly 27 aerial victories. His own commander, John Meyer, who was himself a great ace, called him the greatest fighter pilot who ever squinted through a gun sight. His end was a tragedy with no villain. On Christmas Day, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Preddy was chasing a German fighter low over the front lines. He had already downed 2 that morning. As he roared in at low level, American anti-aircraft gunners on the ground, firing at the same low-flying targets, hit his Mustang by mistake. The top Mustang ace of the war was lost to friendly fire at the age of 25. His younger brother Bill, also a Mustang pilot, would be killed a few months later strafing an airfield near Prague. And then there were the Red Tails. At an airfield called Ramitelli on the eastern coast of Italy flew a group of pilots who had to fight two enemies, the Germans in the air and prejudice at home. They were the Tuskegee Airmen, the first African-American military pilots in United States history. Trained at a segregated base in Alabama, doubted and dismissed by many who should have known better, they were finally given their chance and finally given Mustangs. They painted the tails of their aircraft bright red, and the name stuck, the Red Tails. Their commander was Colonel Benjamin Davis, a hard, disciplined leader who gave them one unbending rule. Their job was not personal glory, their job was the bombers. The story goes that he told his pilots plainly, "If you lose a bomber, don't bother to come back." So while other groups sometimes chased kills, the Red Tails stayed close to the men they were protecting. Bomber crews learned to love the sight of those Red Tails sliding into position alongside them. They escorted bombers deep into Germany, Austria, and across the Balkans, and into Czechoslovakia, to targets like the airfield at Pardubice. One of them, Charles McGee, flew a Mustang he named Kitten, and went on to serve his country in 3 wars and live past 100 years old. The Red Tails finished the war with a record any unit would envy. They flew with such discipline that they earned a reputation fiercely defended by the men themselves for losing remarkably few of the bombers they were sworn to guard. The Germans, who came to respect and fear them, are said to have called them the Black Birdmen. The men of the 8th and 15th Air Forces came from farms and factories and big cities. One of them was a young Mustang pilot named Chuck Yeager. He was shot down over France, but he escaped the Germans with the help of the French resistance and slipped over the mountains into neutral Spain to freedom. He talked his way back into combat and later shot down a German jet. Years after the war, he would become the first man to fly faster than sound. But in 1944, he was just one more kid in a Mustang. By the last winter of the war, Germany played its final card in the air, the jet. The Messerschmitt. Me-262 was a genuine marvel, years ahead of anything the Allies had. With 2 jet engines, it could top 540 miles an hour, far faster than any Mustang. In theory, it was untouchable. On paper, no propeller fighter should have been able to lay a glove on it. But a marvel is only as good as the fuel and the pilots and the runways it needs, and by now Germany was running short of all 3. The Mustang pilots learned the jet's 2 weak moments. A jet was slow and heavy on takeoff and slow again as it came in to land. So the Americans simply waited near the German jet bases, circling high, and dove on the jets when they were low and vulnerable. They also learned that in a screaming dive from high altitude, a Mustang could build up enough speed to catch a jet in level flight for a few precious seconds. The most advanced fighter in the world could not save the Luftwaffe. There were too few jets, too little fuel, and far too few trained men left to fly them. The Mustangs swarmed everywhere, owning the sky from the ground to 40,000 feet. The German jets rose like a last gleam of brilliance over a defeat that was already total. And the numbers tell that defeat plainly. More than 15,000 Mustangs were built. At its peak, an American factory could turn one out and have it ready in a matter of hours, while German workers struggled to build far fewer of their own fighters under a rain of bombs. By the end of the war, 14 of the 15 fighter squadrons of the 8th Air Force flew Mustangs. In the European skies, P-51s were credited with destroying nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft, more than any other American fighter in that theater. But the deepest number is the one you cannot see on a scoreboard. It is the bomber crews who lived. Before the Mustang, deep raids into Germany had been a death sentence. After the Mustang, the loss rates fell, and the men who once had almost no chance of finishing their tours began to come home. Thousands of young men got to grow old because a fighter could finally fly the whole way with them. The Germans understood what had happened to them, and after the war they said so without flinching. Adolf Galland, the brilliant young general who led the German fighter force, looked back without bitterness toward the machine itself. He had begged for fighters that could not be built, fuel that did not exist, pilots who could not be trained fast enough. The Allies had all three in oceans. The Mustang was simply the sharp edge of that overwhelming weight. And Goering, the man who had once boasted that no enemy aircraft would ever fly over Berlin, was left with his single broken sentence. When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. He had seen, in those small silver fighters circling his capital, the proof that the war was already lost. In the years that followed, old enemies grew old together, and the anger faded into something like respect. At airshows across America and Europe, the Mustang became the star, its Merlin engine making a deep, rolling thunder that anyone who has heard it never forgets. German veterans and American veterans stood side by side and looked up at the same aircraft that had once tried to kill each other beneath. The Mustang flew on long after the war that made it famous. It fought again in Korea. Some nations flew Mustangs into the 1980s, 4 decades after that day over Berlin. It is still, for many, simply the most beautiful fighter ever built. But beauty was never really the point. The point was what that beauty carried. The P-51 Mustang was the answer to an impossible problem. How do you protect the bombers all the way to the heart of the enemy and all the way home again? For 2 terrible years there had been no answer, only graves. Then an American airframe met a British engine and a few drop tanks closed the gap that had cost so many lives. The fighter that took the bombers all the way to Berlin and back did not win the war by itself. No machine ever does. But it broke the back of the German Air Force in the place that mattered most, in the high cold air over Germany, and it brought tens of thousands of frightened young men home to their families. That young German pilot over Berlin, banking into the sun on the 6th of March 1944, had seen the future in a single glance. The little friends had come all the way, and they were never going to turn back again.